1987. He's lectured in agroforestry at the University of Melbourne. He runs his own farmer training program. His own farmer cluster groups are really successful. He teaches agroforestry kind of internationally. And I think what's going to be really interesting about the session from Rowan, that what I'm really looking forward to, is it's still agroforestry is still rather in its infancy in the UK. So we've now got more examples of young designs to look at than we've ever had before, but we have very few examples still of mature agroforestry systems, and how we can kind of bring those into farm practices. So it'd be really interesting to hear about more of that from Rowan. And I'm going to take this opportunity to just hand straight over to you, Rowan.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I can't see everyone, but I'm in the south of Australia and coming to you. It's about 4 o'clock in the morning here, and but I am preparing for a time difference because I'm flying to Europe next on Thursday, 2 days' time, to attend the European Agroforestry Conference. My name's Rowan Reid. If I get this working all right, I am a forester. I'm on a farm. The property we're on here is 100 acres that I had since 1987. But I also am a forest scientist. I set up the first university course on agroforestry that run in Australia. That was 1991 at Melbourne University. And I still lecture into that course, but I left Melbourne University in 2010, particularly to focus on working within farmer groups and working on my own farm. So there was a period of about 20 years that I was an academic, senior academic at Melbourne University, and I still work on that position just occasionally. So to put you in perspective, here we are at the south of Australia. Some of you may have visited. It's tropical to the north half, very temperate to the south half. And the area we're on, about 38 south, makes us about equivalent to Lisbon in Portugal or San Francisco in terms of climate. I've been to both those areas, and eucalypts grow really well in Portugal and in California. Our native eucalypts from this area, and we grow the Californian species. And I was going to start with this, cutting down our redwoods. So we planted these about 37 years ago. This young guy his job is to sell timber for guitar making. So I did the harvest. You notice the trees are pruned up for high quality timber, and they're spaced out to promote growth. And that's pretty much our approach to managing the trees for timber production. So I guess you could say we're matured in our tree growing now, because we're harvesting quite a few different trees, and I'll show you some examples. The redwoods were particularly planted for soil erosion control, as I'll explain. But now we do small scale harvesting, chainsaws to fell the tree, the tractor, the logging winch, and a small sawmill operation. And this is the timber we got out for that tree from redwood. It's got a knotty core section down the center of the tree due to our past pruning operations. And now we're trying to extract the guitar timbers, the soundboard. And James sent me this photo of how he's mapped out how he can get out of our timber complete heartwood of clear heartwood to make the faces of the guitars. So we'll be selling this product, but this is sort of added to our list. When we planted the trees, we had no idea we'd be selling some timber for musical instruments. But what we've seen in Australia and worldwide is a dramatic decline in the availability of some timbers. And that includes soundboards from the US out of spruce, and our local guitar makers, quite a big company. And they're actually very interested now in sourcing timbers from farm grown product. This is what that that little redwood forest look like in the foreground about 1991. We've got a range of different species on the farm. They're all planted for multiple uses. They're all intensively managed, so you can see me up a tree pruning the branches off to improve wood quality. That's when they were just finished pruning. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. And we plant them for this particular problem. We've got very aggressive sodic soils, prone to soil erosion. They erode deeply. This photograph shows how the eucalypts and pines and other species you plant can't solve that problem. But quite surprisingly, we found redwoods can solve that soil erosion problem. So we have a big rainfall event like this. The water doesn't go underneath the ground as it does through a lot of the sodic soils. It goes over the surface. So our approach to agroforestry on this farm and the way we actually operate or talk about it nationally to landholders is we plant trees because we want trees in the landscape, and then we manage them for a lot of different other purposes. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you're looking for aesthetics of biodiversity or conservation outcomes, shade and shelter on the farm, trying to fit those multiple objectives together so it works. And my point will always be that this design has to be done right from the farm scale up rather than from the top down in that sense. So timber growing in our community here is really seen as a byproduct of growing trees because we want particularly soil and water conservation. We want more biodiversity. Now we're talking about carbon in the landscape, particularly shade and shelter on all the working farms. And people really value aesthetics, the sense that the enhancing property values and improving the appearance of the property in many ways. So I work in the farming community where farmers actually own land as family farmers. This map of Australia shows different ownership levels. The dark blue areas is private freehold, probably 100,000 farming families. There are some corporate farms in some of the larger drier areas, but essentially around the southeast up into the coast of Queensland and in Western Australia, there are family farms. They're the ones who choose whether or not a tree gets planted. And in that landscape, has been a dramatic impact of clearing for farming. So our area was settled by you colonists over there who came over and landed here and took the country. And as a result, it was cleared for agriculture. My own family's been involved in that since the mid-1800s. My great uncle came out from Scotland and settled here as a farmer when he was only 25. He already had a farm, quite a large property, probably saw about 100,000 sheep on that farm, and didn't have to pay for it, which is obviously the issue we're facing today with regard to colonialism. And in that landscape, we now, as a result of clearing for agriculture, we have massive land degradation issues right across the landscape. Loss of biodiversity has been quite extreme. A lot of farms lack shade and shelter in extreme heat conditions, but also cold. The top left is deaths following the shearing of sheep, very common to have losses, big loss events due to cold weather. And this cold weather, it's not cold like European standards. It might be 2 days of rain following shearing, where a farmer loses 30% of their sheep if it's associated with strong winds. So if you take this as an example of what our farming landscape looks like today, you've got a lot of farmers interested in trying to change that landscape to pass on to the next generation a more sustainable, viable, and diversified farming landscape than the one that we had in that period. So there's the great opportunity for trees in this landscape. But as I said, the fitting of trees into this complex landscape of different motivations and interests, different resources, different problems, you've actually got to work very closely with the landholders. When I was 25, my mother sold a property, the one that was established about 120 years ago, running sheep. And she said to me that she would offer me as a young forester the opportunity to get some farmland if I could come up with a good reason. And I said, I've just come back from Europe. I want to change the way agroforestry has been discussed. We've got I don't know what it's going to look like, but I need a property that needs trees. So we found this property in 1987, and you can see the degraded watercourse here. There's a bridge crossing further up. You probably can't tell, but there's weeds and there's exposure. There was a little bit of regrowth forest of eucalypts on it from about the Second World War. So my intention when purchasing this property was to change the way we were talking to farmers about forestry, changing forestry, not changing the farmers into foresters, which my profession was particularly keen on doing. We've had a history of government programs trying to promote forestry or even agroforestry, whatever you call it, onto farms that involve grant programs. In my view, none of them have worked because they're very top down. Committees decide what the best tree to plant is, and they go out and promote it, and farmers aren't involved in the design work. So I really wanted to take it from the farmer back. And first thing we did on our property was plant trees where a farmer might plant them along the creek. But the difference is we managed them for timber production. Other plantings were in shelter belts, so we managed them for timber, or unproductive land where those soil erosions was, where we planted the redwoods. And the property, this is after about 14 years of tree growing. And you can probably tell by the prune trees that they're actively managed. And I actually felt about this stage, we'd already built the house, the shearing shed. We were running about 400 wethers on the property to keep the grass down. The trees were benefiting from the sheep because the sheep were reducing the fire risk, controlling the weeds, grazing the grass, providing a very small income. But for us, the ultimate game was to produce timber out of a farming landscape. Here we are 35 years later. Just out the door behind you is our new house. Other than the windows in that picture, all the timber was grown from planted trees on our farm. All that timber, none of it actually went out the front gate. So we planted the seedling, managed the trees, harvested them, dried the timber, milled and dried the timber, then used it on farm. And I've got to work out how much we've saved, if anything at all, by doing it all ourselves. But there's still a lot of trees out there. And someone suggested the other day I should measure my tree area by how many houses I can grow. We have a big housing shortage in Australia, and all the talk is about where we can get resources for more houses out of the landscape. So I've already alluded to a couple of things. First of all, our approach to agroforestry is plant trees where you want trees rather than plant trees for a particular product option, because so often those products are so far down the track. Plant them because you want trees, but then focus on managing those trees so that you can see whether you can keep an opportunity for particularly a commercial return or maybe just an on-farm value in the future. So this active management is something we're very much focused on. We have a view in Australia by many people, including most landholders, that if you want a good forest, you just plant the trees, walk away, and nature will design the forest for you and grow it, particularly if you're looking at conservation outcomes. That's not the case. Nature doesn't know where it's going. So I don't actually like this term that I often hear, let nature take its course. So I equated to a kid rolling a wheel down a hill like this. And that child is in East Timor, where we do some work with farmers trying to explore how they can grow trees and make a commercial return from it. But that act of rolling a wheel down a hill really equated to me about tree planting. In most cases, whether it's for timber production or conservation outcomes, or even shade and shelter, farmers plant the trees as if they're just throwing that wheel off the top of the hill, and then they don't touch them again. But by running with your forest and actively managing it over time, you can direct that forest to the outcomes that you're actually looking for, whether they're enrichment planting as the trees grow, if it's the active management of pruning, it's thinning operations so you can control grazing values or a range of other things. So our focus of agroforestry and our farmer education is really about where do you start in terms of what wheel do you throw off the hill? And particularly, how do you run with that wheel? What can you do as the trees are growing to direct their growth in different directions? So to illustrate, I'll use some different examples. We have a very fine furniture and guitar timber called blackwood. It's an acacia. It grows around Australia. There's many species in the genera, but this one's our local native species. We plant that tree, a lot of plantings, because it's indigenous, because it's good for wildlife. It fixes nitrogen. It's a good component of shelter belts and particularly riparian plantings. But this active management, once the tree's planted, you start reading the growth of the tree and manipulate it as it grows so that you can start increasing the probability of getting a higher return if you come to the point of harvesting that tree. We study the quality of the wood that generates in the tree, and if we're interested in seed production, native food, we explore those as the trees are growing. We explore and talk about the market and how it's changing for these various products. And then ultimately, if it's the right time, we might harvest the tree. And this is a blackwood that is also going for guitar timbers. We planted this tree back in 1987. It's been growing along a road selectively harvested. We wouldn't clear fell in our conservation plantings, but we're taking out that timber, and you can see we're getting dark coloured timber that we can get guitars and furniture out of as a result of that. So this is the creek planting. In the creek area, we fenced it out, planted a range of different native species, actively managed them. Again, this is a eucalypt we're harvesting from that creek planting. And I use a logging winch and a tractor to do selective harvesting. And then this is another example, this 36-year-old eucalypt. It's about to come back to the house as the stairs for the new house. We planted that back in 1987, and that's on our new sawmill. When you open up these, you can see the various benefits of doing that active management. So, and behind we can see a kiln where we dry the timber. The timber is dried in a solar kiln for most purposes, but if we need flooring or some very high value end use, we send it to a commercial drying facility not far away from here. So this is some of the furniture that's been sold in showrooms in Melbourne from trees we planted for conservation, managed for biodiversity, shelter, harvested for profit. This is 1 day's harvesting of 22-year-old eucalypts along our creek system. They were sent to China and came back as veneer. And there's a basketball court in Melbourne, in our local city. The whole back wall of this basketball court and part of the roof, the lighter coloured timber, was harvested from our riparian creek system. This timber on our new house here came from another planting from a shelter belt tree. So again, you won't get this quality of timber unless you actively manage the trees. We lock up carbon in all the wood, and that block of wood that we grew has the carbon dioxide equivalent of what's held in that beach ball, and you can go through all the mathematics to do that. A lot of people talk about locking carbon up in living trees, standing trees, but if we harvest the trees and lock it up in timber, we can replant and lock up more carbon in that. And part of the problem we have is all the carbon rules that we've adopted from Kyoto and various other projects around the world don't acknowledge the carbon that's actually locked up in the wood, and therefore deny farmers the opportunity to continually harvest carbon over a period of time and sell it the same way they sell their wool or their milk. Rather, farmers get paid just to change land from pasture to tree cover, and only get rewarded for the carbon that's locked in the standing trees. We have real issues here now about farmers carrying on a liability into the future generations to keep those trees actually alive, which is really difficult given the increasing temperatures, higher risk of fires and floods that we've experienced in Australia. We've got many Australian native species that produce very valuable timber, but also are very ideal for planting on farms. And silky oak, which we call an oak because of the ray cells that some of you are aware of in your English oaks. But they're really good for wildlife. This is an endangered sugar glider. They glide from tree to tree, and in winter, they can only survive if they can extract the gum out of a tree. Now, when we prune our trees, we find the sugar gliders like that because they climb a tree and glide to the next tree. And so they're eating the gum off the tree to get through the winter. So we're planting trees for soil conservation and shade and shelter. They're providing biodiversity habitat, and that fits in really neatly. So in effect, you could argue that timber production is supporting biodiversity in these farming landscapes. This is back in 1988, showing how we established some of the trees. I was working in New Zealand prior to when we got the farm, and there was a lot of use of electric fencing to allow grazing from an early age. This is black walnut, chestnut, and poplar in this area. I tried electric fencing, but I don't do that anymore because we've got too many kangaroos and they just run through all your fences now and break them. I've tried the European tree shelters. You can see this is a very early planting of English oaks. I've got a number of rows. I've got a row here of tree shelters. But at that time, I started exploring flexible tree guards. And now we use a guard that's about 1.2 meters tall. It's flexible, meaning that we use a fiberglass rod. And that means that the sheep can't rub on it and get any relief from their itching. Rubbing on solid posts just pushes them over. And kangaroos and wallabies can't graze them, and they bounce back up straight when they bounce on top of them, which they do. And
so we have to protect this tree. We can't use a small guard because the sheep and the wallabies will just pull that apart. So we use a tall, flexible guard, and we use a 2 meter long fiberglass post, which is flexible. And then we run a sleeve over the top and then tie that down.
So that guard actually allows me to plant a tree anywhere that I want a tree. I can protect it from sheep, the wallabies, which are the small kangaroos, and now the large kangaroos have come back. The next problem we're going to have is the deer. Deer were introduced to Australia for hunting purposes, and they're getting up in numbers and they're moving through the area, and they're causing a lot of devastation to farmers who have got tree planting in the area. You'll see that I've actually chipped an area of grass there. We normally do herbicide treatment around the tree for 1 year to get the tree established. The kangaroos, as I said, you probably expect us to have kangaroos everywhere, when for the first 30 years we didn't, but now they're increasing in numbers. They're largely increasing in numbers because there's less farmers who have now licensed to shoot the kangaroos. So the numbers are getting up. In our valley, there'd be 100 or so across a few farms. In the next valley, there's thousands, and they basically every kangaroo is equivalent to one sheep in terms of the grass that it eats, and so it's creating some real issues for farmers. Tree growing is sort of an alternative income source when you might have declining returns. So this is one of the plantings. It was the one where the sheep were grazing amongst the electric fences. This planting is a number of different species. What we do with anticipation to harvest, I mix fast-growing trees with slow-growing trees, or as the fast-growing trees are growing, I interplant with slow-growing ones. So I'm always able to harvest and never go back to what the paddock was before. And it allows me to have continuous cover forestry, which is a European term, again, that we don't tend to use here. It's really just managing a system to get retain the values that the trees are offering while offering the opportunity to harvest for timber. So we've got poplars, the hybrid poplars here, and the American black walnut. In the book that I wrote, I want to talk a little bit about spruce, because I follow your arguments all the time in the press about spruce. We have the equivalent when you talk about Pinus radiata. So when I wrote this book, I didn't actually include a chapter about pines. And if I was in Europe, I mightn't include a chapter about spruce in a book, because farmers would tend to think that I'm, as a forester, defending the forest industry and their interest in planting pines on farmland. So I didn't, but I do grow pines. But the reasons farmers don't like pine trees are exactly the same as farmers in Europe don't like spruce. The companies buy farms, or they offer big incentives for farmers to put their whole farm under pine plantations. They're not actively managed because they're low intensity, unpruned plantations. There's no grazing opportunity in these. It's removing people from the landscape. It's increasing the fire threat and the weeds, although we've got plenty of problems with those sort of issues in farmland. But we grow our pines as more of a parkland, grazing underneath them for the whole rotation. This is really a shelter off sheep shelter area, where after shearing or during lambing, we can allow the sheep to have access to this. And that's really helped. We don't have any problems with lambing or off-shear sheep problems and shears anymore, because of the shelter we've got on the farm. And we can selectively harvest these now and mill them up and produce timber that's quite different to the timber that's produced by the companies out of their big plantations, completely knot free and clear. And that's the timber that we've been using for beams in houses. So there is market opportunities for farmers to grow species that are used conventionally in industrial forestry or government forestry. And we have those advantages of being able to actively manage it. To use timber in a structural purpose like a house, we have to grade it. We can't do machine grading, which is a common technique around the world, where they either bend a piece of timber or X-ray it and then work out its strength. So I've done a short course in visual grading, and we grade our own timber. So this on the right-hand side, the radiata pine is graded as F7. VSG means visual structural grazing, visual stress grading, and that's got my name on it as a grader. So I'm able now to sell our timber to builders who want to use that clear beams that they can't get from other sources. I'll just use another example of a farm just over the hill. I've worked with Andrew Stewart here in the middle. He's an agricultural scientist, fourth generation farmer, much larger property, more dependent on the agricultural income than I was. Same climate, same market opportunities, but very different tree growing. They currently have about 17% of their farm planted to trees. When we met, he wanted to solve these problems. He had soil erosion, lack of shaded shelter, waterlogging problems. So we worked together to design plantings that address these problems, but also delivered return. Now, I want to go back to the point we're highlighting how different our approach to agroforestry seems to be to that done in America and Europe, where you sort of design models and you find a paddock to put that model in. All our programs with farmers are about solving their immediate problems with trees. So from the day they plant the trees or build the fence to protect them, they're actually moving ahead. They're getting a value almost immediately from that. For example, this creek that Andrew fenced out, planted trees, gets the shade and shelter, the biodiversity, and the improved farm management as a result, and timber production comes as a return. He doesn't graze under these trees, but these trees support the farming enterprise and shelter the paddocks beside there. And in fact, we're all aware of the competition between the trees and the pasture. On the far left, he's got a summer crop that he feeds his sheep on to fatten up his lambs. On the right, he's got the creek system with the trees grown for saw logs, for biodiversity and shade and shelter. And the competition zone becomes a road because he can't drive across this paddock during the winter because it's too wet. So he's found ways of using the negative impact of trees as a positive. He also feeds his grain and hay along these competition zones because they're less muddy and there's less grass, and you get more effective grain fed. So he's actually designed the systems to reflect his particular needs. And you can see an aerial view of the property here about how the trees are carefully integrated. We've done studies on bird life coming back to the farm. He's got over 100 species of birds, and most of the bird species use a number of different forest types and open land as habitat. And we're finding that farms that have multiple land uses on them have much higher biodiversity coverage. This is another planting showing understory of native species for biodiversity, overstory of providing in the shelter belt. Other products we get from our trees are honey, shiitake logs, tree seed, firewood, whole range of different products. And in our farming community now, we've got these products being developed, particularly by some of the younger members of our community who are starting to develop commercial jobs generating from this. The most productive hectare of land that they've got on that sheep farm is actually from harvesting banksias. Banksias are a native flower in Australia. There's about 30 or 40 species. I grow one for timber, but Jill, Andrew's partner, harvests every week from here, and they get about, let me change it to euros, about 400 euros a week from 1 hectare of land by selling banksia flowers. Mother's Day was only a couple of weeks ago. That was 4 or 5 times a bigger event. They also run tours on the property and get paid for running tours. They have school groups. So just like Harriet said before that started, farmers who are diversifying, because they've got trees on their farm, they're able to generate income opportunities, even if it's just about sharing their knowledge about tree growing with other farmers in some way. So in our broader landscape in this area, we've got almost every farmer has planted trees. Almost every planting is done to reflect their primary interests. And so we see quite a diverse range of plantings. We like to think of tree planting on farms as being part of the infrastructure of the farming landscape because they support and underpin the productivity of the agriculture, and ultimately they'll start diversifying their income sources. This is a photo I took in Canada. My view is this is not agroforestry. It's not agroforestry because there's no farmer in this picture. The farmer, this is on a research site. This is just research into how trees interact with crops. That's all really useful stuff. But what we do in Australia, we don't present agroforestry as a mixture of crops and trees and agriculture and trees. We talk about it as a design process to work out where you're going. So agroforestry is the result of farmers choosing to grow and manage trees. So that for tree growing to be agroforestry, there must be a farmer involved in the design process. There is no knowing where that will end up. In some cases, there may not be a tree planted because it's too risky or uncertain, or they're not confident about the result. But the point of making this definition is that we can focus very much on how we can support and encourage farmers to go through that process of trying to explore how the tree growing might fit. This is one of the tours we run on the property. Hundreds of farmers are now interested in exploring what they might do with tree growing. This is an aerial photograph from satellite data. It shows tree growing in blue since 1990. That yellow circle is my own farm, which is almost now covered in trees. The dark green area is where trees were grown prior to 1990. And this property over here is Andrew Stewart's. You can see there's about 17% tree cover, a lot of belts, riparian areas on that. And all these other properties, most of these are farmers who are growing trees for the interests that they have. And we find in our little district here, it's probably about 10 kilometres across this region. that there's about 20% tree cover in the landscape, the farming landscape, excluding the forest down in the bottom area, and that most of those trees are planted by farmers, predominantly without a grant, because they want trees, and many of those have been managed for timber production. So we have what we call a community of change, a community group we call the Otway Agroforestry Network, in this vicinity, covers about 200-kilometre square area or so. And there's about 200 families that are members of this. They pay to join the group. And what the group does is actively involve farmers in the design process. We have a book, which is a bestseller in Australia, about regenerative agriculture by Charles Massey here. And he actually talks about how different our network is in terms of building farmer-driven outcomes. What we do as a group, we run Master TreeGrower courses, a course that I set up 25 years ago. We pay farmers to visit farmers, and we undertake a lot of networking with regard to industry groups. We support farmer decision making. We have no grants for trees. You cannot get any free fences or a free tree off our farmer group, even though we've spent about $3 or $4 million of government money. We put all that money into people in terms of education programs and our innovative peer mentoring. We actually train farmers to talk to farmers. So if a farmer's interested in tree growing or wants to join our group, we will send 2 or 3 experienced farmers to their property. No one from government, no employed extension agents, full-time farmers. We pay them to go and talk to another farmer about their interest in tree growing. And as a result, we've actually found that there is greater adoption of tree growing because we're investing in people, not trees, as a result of that. We'd like to say it's like teaching someone how to paint rather than telling them what to paint on their landscape. And that part of the program is our farmer education program, which started in our area, but I deliver that around the country. Thousands of farmers have done that. And again, it's about giving them the confidence to start exploring. And this is one of these Master TreeGrower groups. We're just running another course at the moment with another 30 participants just in our region. And through that, we get more involvement in our network. A lot of young people get involved. And we took all these people, we took them to the sawmill last weekend so that they can explore some of the market opportunities. As a result of this approach, we get a diversity of forests. Some are block plantings, some are integrated, some are belts, some graze underneath, some don't. That's not important to us. It's about whether we can actually get farmers to benefit from tree growing. The diversity on the ground reflects the diversity of people we have in the landscape, and that's absolutely crucial. And we get more engagement because we're not telling anyone what to do. We're actually helping them achieve what they want. And all the values that the wider community want, whether it's carbon or biodiversity or animal welfare or soil quality, come as a result of farmers doing tree growing the way they want to do it. And that's become really crucial. Our focus is on people, not trees, and through trees we get landscape change. And the programs highlighted here, the local group, our farmer education program, and our national group that runs that. And that's where I want to finish. So thank you very much.
Rowan, that was brilliant. Thank you. And your timing is impeccable. Bang on time. So Maureen has unmuted everybody, so people can ask their questions directly if they want to. But we had 2 questions come in while you were speaking, Rowan, both from the same person. They're about why you apply herbicides around the base of the trees after planting, and also a question about whether your flexible tree guards are reusable and or biodegradable.
Good question. Weed control from grass is crucial for the establishment of our trees. We tend to plant as we come out of winter at the start of spring. You can use a mulch, a carpet, or a weed mat, but it would have to be covering about 1.5 meter diameter area for each tree. And that's because we go into very dry summers, grass steals the moisture. we need to fallow that and retain that moisture for the tree to use. We have a small bush rat, a native animal on this farm. If you lay down any sort of mulch or carpet, it will actually stay under that because these bush rats are scared of going out into the open. So if you graze a paddock, they won't run across a grazed paddock or a bare paddock. So if I can't, now because I've got so much wildlife, I cannot plant trees with a mulch or a carpet or a weed mat. I have to actually chip the grass and keep it totally bare by manual techniques, or we use a herbicide. So I do use a herbicide. I spray pre and post-emergent herbicide prior to planting in a spot and then plant the tree in that. In terms of the plastic, many people are exploring biodegradable. We use a very thin plastic. It's very lightweight. If you use a biodegradable one in our intense sunlight, it will degrade. So getting the degradation to fit the timing is very difficult. We leave the sleeve on probably for about 3 to 4 years with some of the slow growing species. We do take the post away. The fiberglass post can be reused, but the plastic sleeve can't, and that does end up in the rubbish. But there's probably about a tenth of the amount of plastic as a core flute tree shelter in these systems because they're very thin plastic. They come off a long roll, 270 meter roll, which weighs about 10 kilos. So you can see how light it is for each tree guard.
And what's the cost of them roughly?
Well, it's actually become one of my jobs because I invented this guard. So I actually sell it to get through, particularly through COVID and while building a house. So it works out at about, we have to bring in the fiberglass posts from China, the plastic sleeves made in Australia, and it works out at about $4 Australian per tree. And you can reuse the most expensive component, which is the $3 post. And to put that in perspective, the current Australian dollar is worth about 40 pence or whatever. So 2.5 Australian dollars to the pound, the British pound.
I really want to try out one of these fiberglass posts now. I'm so curious as to how this works for sheep.
I travel over to the UK all the time, and I can't believe the amount of money that's spent on tree guards and these solid tree guards where you could be using something flexible. You have the advantage with the oaks and the deciduous trees, they harden off in winter. The reason we can't use the tree shelters here is because our evergreens are very flexible as they come out the top of the guard and they hit that hard rim and they just break off. And the fact that they're not flexible, some of those people who studied biology might remember the term thigmomorphogenesis. When you shake a tree, you get secondary cell thicknessing of the cell walls, and that makes a stronger tree. If you stake a tree and take the stake away, the tree just falls over, and you probably all experience that when you're cleaning out your tree shelter guards. So by being flexible, the guard begins to move in the wind as the tree develops, and the tree develops its own stability and makes a much stronger tree. So there's a biological and a practical reason, plus a cost reason, to go lightweight and flexible and through that system. So I'd really like some of the people over there to trial it. It works very well with our sheep. It doesn't work with cattle. They just tear the things apart. They're a bit too big. But for sheep grazing, once the sheep are trained to them, it works very well. And I can send over details. And you can find your own supplier.
I was going to say, please do. I'll trial it for you if you want to put some in your suitcase on your next trip over. Very happily. George has asked in the Q&A about whether it works for deer as well. And just a reminder to everybody that you do have your microphones on now. So if you want to ask a question verbally, then feel free to put your hand up like Clive's done. So we'll get to you next, Clive. But yeah, George wanted to know if they work for deer as well. Your flexible guards.
Deer are a pest in Australia, and they're moving out of the forest areas. Part of the problem of all of us farmers planting more trees is we get more kangaroos, more foxes, and more wallabies and more deer. The foxes we can manage on farms. Farmers use alpacas to protect their sheep and spotlighting and shooting. but the deer are much more difficult, and they do mess up your trees. Not so much because they're browsing young trees, is that they rub on the trees and do their markings and really break the trees. So no, I don't expect my guard to work with deer.
Clive, did you had a question? Because I thought I saw a hand up over you, but I'm appreciating it might not have been quite right. Am I just picking on you unnecessarily? Clive?
Steve has.
Yeah, I can see that Steve has. I swear I saw a hand over Clive earlier. We'll go to you, Steve, as your microphone is off and your hand is up.
Yeah, that was amazing. Really positive about trees and the value that you can get from them. I'm just wondering, within your group, any reflections from the animal people about whether they've had incredible advantages on animal productivity, or also actually getting more value for the animal products, like in the Dehesa, where you can get about $20,000 for a pig because it's been eating the right stuff from trees. Whether you have any Australian examples. We heard about the timber, but what about animal?
So I mentioned Andrew. Andrew's, as I sort of emphasized, he's an ex-scientist. I'm a forester, and we've worked together for 35 years. His focus is always on the agriculture production. They produce fat lambs and wool. He's got 17% tree cover, but he still produces the same amount of agriculture production as they did before they started planting trees. There are many reasons for that. He certainly also improved his genetics and his pasture management. But the main thing is the lambing percentages. They run, say, 1,000 ewes or 1,500 ewes. So from those 1,500 ewes, their lambing percentages are now well over 150%, which is pretty good in our open. We don't have, obviously, bring the sheep into sheds. They're all outside for lambing. And so his biggest advantage of trees, he would argue, is increased lambing percentage and off-shear shelter in terms of that. In terms of pasture production, there is the competitive effect because we're in a very dry landscape through summer. You got competition. Wherever you plant a tree, you will get less grass. And I say that pretty confidently, except maybe things like black walnut and poplar and some things that are deciduous. But even then, you're going to find reduced pasture production. But the benefits are also coming through by producing carbon neutral, and their farms now being classified and measured as carbon neutral. And they're not selling their carbon to some polluting fossil fuel user. They're holding all their carbon on farm so that they can market their product as carbon neutral. And that is seen to be a marketing advantage. And whether or not we can get something added benefit through the feed. Now, the sheep on our place eat the acorns. There's lots of issues, and the local vet's concerned about the risk of acorns causing death, because she's actually spent a bit of time in Europe too. As far as I understand, the case studies show that when stock are affected by feeding on acorns, it's usually after a storm event that drops a lot of immature acorns on the ground. You can correct me if you like, but we have no problems feeding acorns. They drop during a time of the year where we're waiting for the autumn break. There could be no pasture at all, but the animals are pregnant, so it's very important that they're in good condition. And we're finding on this farm that our ewes are in really good condition going into lambing, and I attribute a lot of that to the fact they're eating acorns.
Great, good answer.
Andy, you've got your hand up.
Hi there. Have you done much research into shade tolerance of different grass species, and are your native grass species more shade tolerant because they've evolved under trees in the past?
Yeah, that's there has been quite a bit of work on that. In the south here, in the temperate zone, we tend to have temperate pastures that are predominantly C3 grasses, and our native species tend to be C4 grasses. Now, I can explain that very simply by saying C4 grasses tend to grow during the summer months, and there's a lot of interest now in more native C4 grasses in your pasture so that you get green picked during the summer. Problem with C4 grasses is that you provide any shade at all and their production drops off very quickly. C3 grasses tend to be more shade tolerant. We've got a range of different species, but it's not, in terms of the loss of production, it's not the shade which is the issue. It's essentially the moisture competition. We go through up to a 6-month period with evaporation rates being very much higher than rainfall, and we find that it's the moisture competition. Particularly, a lot of our soils are quite shallow. If you go to our deeper soils where you might grow something like black walnut, you have less of a problem on those soils because the root systems tend to be deeper and there's more soil area to explore. But we've got very old soils, they're quite shallow, infertile. The roots are predominantly in the surface soil, and as a result of that, the competition is very intense for moisture during the summer. So we haven't discovered the holy grail of plant more trees, get more grass. But up in the trop, there is clearly some opportunities where you can have more trees and more grass in simultaneous systems, and that's attracting quite a deal of attention. I suppose because of that reason, it's if a farmer's focused on their primary income coming from pasture production, they're going to be reluctant to plant trees across a paddock, but they're not reluctant to plant trees where they need trees, where they don't need to graze, or on relatively unproductive land, they can put trees in and then use that as a shelter haven for stock that are grazing good paddocks next door. The idea of putting trees across, I would have been run out of the community if I, as a young agroforester, telling farmers to plant trees in the middle of the heck. I do graze under all my trees, simply because I've shifted from pasture to timber, because of, I'm well down the track, if you like, and grazing has great opportunities for fire protection and weed control. I keep alluding to fire. That is the big threat. If we can reduce ground fuels, we can control fire intensity and our ability to fight fire, and the trees reduce the wind speed, and that reduces the rate of spread of the fire across the paddock. And they are the key methods to actually reduce the fire risk and protect life and assets, but also protect stock and make it easier to fight a fire should we have one.
Thank you. Have you considered looked at side pruning the roots with a sharp disc to reduce the roots spread into the upper layers of the soil, therefore competing for moisture?
Oh, yes. Well, that has been done in some of the areas along the edge of shelter belts, and it does work, but temporarily. You've got to keep ripping deeper and deeper, particularly, it works out soil because you can cut those shallow roots, but you got to keep going deeper because the roots get around you somehow. Yeah, it has been done, short-term benefits to date, and people haven't carried it on.
Interesting, thank you.
There are a couple of comments in the Q&A. There's a bit of just people being fans of you, Rowan. So Clive didn't have a question earlier, but he does want to take the opportunity to say thank you very much, both for the presentation and how much he learns from following you on LinkedIn. So I guess that's maybe a tip for all of us to follow you on LinkedIn. And Fred is saying he's really impressed with the quality of the knot-free timber that you showed. And he'd love to try out some of your tree guards on his farm in Northern Ireland. So I think we have another volunteer for that. But I do also have a question from Deck. He says, can you expand on the silver arable slide that you said this is not agroforestry? Was it because it was a monoculture of trees in selected rows? I'm sure lots of us would be interested in that one.
I actually I don't use the term silvo arable or silvo pastoral or anything like that, because we're dealing with dynamic systems, and if you plant trees, even if you plant them through a paddock and graze underneath the trees, you might take a photo of that and someone will say, oh, that's silver pastoral system. And I said, what do you mean? If I take the sheep off, the system's changed because I'm not grazing anymore. What I'm trying to suggest is these dynamic systems can change over time. You might start in a certain management plan, but you tap the wheel as it's growing and you say, I'm going to take this in a different direction. I might enrich this planting, take the stock out and emphasize the biodiversity values or the understory native food production I can get from it. If we use terms like silvopastoral, agro, whatever they are, we tend to lock people's thinking into it's got to be this on the farm. So I say that picture from Canada of the crop growing between the black walnuts, it's not agroforestry, because if we show photos like that and we tell farmers this is agroforestry, we're ignoring the opportunity for them to work from the ground up and work out how trees can suit their farm. By the same token, if researchers come and look at our property and say, well, that's not agroforestry there because you fenced the area off, I say, let's go right back to the origins of agroforestry. Back in 1987, in the Agroforestry Systems Journal, there was an article called Diagnosis and Design. I focus on that, and I want to talk about that at the European Agroforestry Conference, because diagnosis and design is a way to work out where trees fit for that particular landholder or that community. It doesn't preempt the answer. Whereas what we've had since is a lot of people trying to find the answer and promote the answer in trials. And I know this is the case in Ireland and Europe as well. I don't think you'll get anywhere. I think you'll keep fighting and saying farmers aren't adopting agroforestry. They're not doing this. But if you go back to diagnosis first and then work with communities to say, where do you want into your farming landscape for a range of different uses? They will say, oh, sure, I want trees. I want them for these purposes or this way. And I'm not prepared to do that, but I want to try this. And as a result, in our community, we've got higher adoption rates of tree growing on farms than anywhere else in Australia. There is more diversity of activity here than anywhere I've seen in the world, and I travel a lot in terms of diversity of what I call agroforestry, different ways of growing trees on every farm. And I fight with my government all the time because our government, nationally and state level, continually wanting to give farmers money to plant trees, but they always get a special interest group or a expert group in there to tell us what trees farmers should plant. And as soon as you do that, you're not going to get the trees that farmers want, and you're not going to get the cultural change that we've been working on to build it up over a period of time. It takes a generation to build tree growing within a community, because people have to go through a process of exploring and getting support and feeling like they're in a community of change. We've achieved that in our area, and I'm keen to encourage other regions to let go of their preferred models and work with farmers to explore. Do the research of tree crop interactions. That's fantastic. I've done some myself, but use that to inform decision making, not to give farmers the answer about the best combination of trees and grass or crops. I hope that helps. I can get very emotional about that.
No, I think it's great, really interesting. And if nothing else, you've given me something to say to people when they ask me what tree to plant. I'll be like, no, I'll help you find the answer for you.
Well, exactly. The answer is always, it depends. And start a conversation based on, well, what does it depend on? What do you want to do? What your interests are? What the markets are like? How you think the markets are going to change? That's the conversation that we have with farmers.
Excellent. Steve and Andy, are those your old hands or have you got new questions?
I've got a new question.
Go for it, Steve.
Yeah, so it's very impressive, the kind of community of action you've got with farmers helping farmers, and you see how that grows. But what about government? Has the government done anything useful? Or
Has that done anything I like? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's number one. And number two is, now you've got some wisdom, how can the government come in to even build on a greater multiplier effect and scale it up?
Thanks for that. Back in 1993, when Andrew and I started the Otway Agroforestry Network, the local department, government office, had some money to hand out grants for trees on farms, farm forestry, they called it. We told them, please do not provide any of those grants to our region. So we actually argued with government up front that we don't want you to do any of your grant in our community. And that was probably pretty offensive to some of our own farmers, because we tried to discourage them from applying for grants or government giving them money. We had our own funds, and we got those funds from the federal government. We had those funds, and we started running field days and surveys and problem solving with farmers with tree growing, and that's how we built the network up. We've outlived all those government programs. They tend to go by the wayside after about 3 years funding. We have continued to get funding from government, but our money is currently coming through a sort of conservation stream through the catchment management authorities, we call them, and they have funding to manage landscapes for environmental outcomes. And we've now got them realizing that we don't want them to fund the conservation trees on farms. We want them to invest in the community. So they're actually funding our education programs in the community at the moment. And I should say that the people who run our group are all paid, but they're all tree growers, and no one's got a full-time job. So we get paid to sort of a day a week or whatever. And what we find that farmers don't like government vehicles coming up their driveway. We have different number plates on government vehicles, and if a government vehicle comes in your driveway, you go, bloody hell, I hope they don't see what I'm doing on the property, because governments tend to want to stop people doing things or save the environment. And we've actually had local government come to our property after they looked at aerial photographs, and they thought they mapped our plantings as native forest. And they stood there and they said, it's native forest. And I showed them a photo where before I planted the trees, and said, no, I planted these trees. And I said, why do you think it's native forest? And they said, oh, because they're not planted in straight lines. And it was just this simplistic approach that they had to, if it's not straight lines, it can't be planted. But we manage our systems to deliver biodiversity and aesthetics, so we don't plant our trees in straight lines. And then they said they wanted to, even though I planted them, protect those trees because they were providing biodiversity values. And I said, you're not going to stop me harvesting these trees? And they said, yes. And I said, well, the next door neighbor has got cows actually walking down these creeks, pooing in the creek, and you're going to tell them that if they plant a tree to protect that creek, they'll never be able to touch that tree. And as a result of that, we got our community group activated, we got the politicians out, and we stopped all that happening, because governments have to be very careful about regulating to protect something because of the perverse outcomes. So the two things government do that I don't like is provide grants for trees and fences because of the fact that the farmers aren't involved in the design, and regulate to try and protect or restrict what farmers do on the pretense that they're protecting the environment, because the perverse outcome is that farmers won't plant native trees if they don't believe they're allowed to cut them down, or even if they have no interest in cutting them down in the future, they believe they will lose their property rights. So we talk to government all the time. What we want them to do is reward the growers who actually produce the products. So we've got a situation here where sawmills have actually gone in this region because the native forest, public forests have all been closed, no more logging. And we say to government, well, you close the sawmills, why don't you help us market our timber to the sawmill that's 300 or 400 kilometres away? Provide certification that some companies are actually saying they can't buy our products because they're not certified as being whether it's F.For.Sci certification or something like that. Certification is a very expensive cost. Government can actually support certification and assist with that. Do more research on the quality of the wood products, the bush food marketing, the seed production, the research that benefits all growers rather than just handing out a grant to one or two people. So we're always asking government to invest more in this sector. They don't need more money because they've just got to take some of the money they spend handing out grants to put it in these other areas, and we can get real change. There are millions of dollars for tree growing, but in our approach, they're spending that money the wrong way to get cultural change.
I got a bit confused. So when you pay, so the good thing government's doing, is it to pay the farmers to spread the word, or to pay the farmers to achieve environmental outcomes on a landscape scale? I got a bit confused.
Well, yeah. Well, you got to invest in people so that they can make better decisions for themselves. If they want to buy the products or help us market the products, certainly, but don't provide funding for the actual growing of the trees. It's just because they can't do it well. They don't do it in a way that encourages innovation. We also have governments interested in buying biodiversity outcomes or buying carbon outcomes. But every time governments set up a program like that, the interest groups that influence government put so many conditions on it. For example, even though Andrew's got more bird life back on his property, if we had a biodiversity market where farmers could be rewarded for the biodiversity on their property, we know that the interest groups would say, well, you can't possibly give money to a farmer who intends to cut the trees down, or a farmer who's planting trees that don't naturally grow in the area. Because the interest groups influence government policy so much, they actually discourage farmers from finding innovative ways to develop those outcomes. So we want the investment in research, and we want the investment in infrastructure that benefit all landholders, and we want the investment in given to the communities to help the communities build their own culture of tree growing. So we have a community group here. We pay the landholders who run it. We pay the mentors that talk to other farmers. We provide very good food at our events. We pay farmers who host a field day. They get paid. We pay the mills that we visit to take tours to. Everyone gets paid from government money, but that money, they can choose to spend it on a holiday or plant a tree. We think there'll be more trees planted with that money because they're enthused to do it. So it's about getting the payments right. I don't think there's any problem about a shortage of government interest in handing out money, but providing a grant does not encourage the next farmer next door to plant trees. If one farmer gets a grant, the one next door says, well, I won't plant trees until I get a grant. But what we've found, if a farmer plants their own trees and the farmer next door looks over the fence and sees them pruning those trees, the farmer who's watching thinks, well, Joe over there thinks he's going to make money out of these trees, or that those trees are good. I better go and learn something about them. But if they're funded by government, the farmers just think, well, I'm just going to wait till someone gives me the money, and I won't ever spend my own money. I'll spend that on something else. So it's about farmer decision-making and rational behaviour of landholders, given the incentives that are provided. And I know you're not going to undo your government incentive programs, but I'm amazed how government just end up increasing the amount that they offer farmers because farmers aren't adopting. And I say, what I saw some posted, £10,000 a hectare or something to plant trees. Well, a farmer might say, well, I won't plant trees because next year it might be $20,000 a hectare they're giving me. Because farmers are rational people and they're making decisions about their family asset and their family business. So all the farmers who received a grant of only £1,000 5 years ago are thinking, bugger, I've just missed out on a huge grant now because they've increased the grants. It's the perverse outcomes to me are just so obvious. And the fact that farmers aren't adopting tree growing in areas is largely, in my view, because there's no culture development and all the focus is on government-funded tree planting on farms. And you just don't see the community development that we've been able to achieve in this area in the last 25 years. So I know it's controversial.
Fantastic wisdom. That's really wise what you were saying.
It's almost like, Rowan, that they announced the new SFI agroforestry funding for England today. Um,
There you go. An enormous
um,
amount of money. I better find out before I go to the Czech Republic
it's not that
during the week.
much. Like, and
Could you send me,
yeah, of course.
send me the email?
Well,
What I'd be particularly interested in what they call agroforestry. We're going to give you money for this, but not for that. And as soon as people do that, you've actually, again, the farmer's not involved in the decision making. So it's not going to be the appropriate outcome for each landholder, which is what we work on. Our farmers start very small. They might plant 100 trees in a shelter belt, try a different species. If that succeeds, they plant more and more and more. Landscape change comes because people build up confidence over a period of 10 or 15 years, and the outcomes. And trees take a long time to grow, so we shouldn't be in a great hurry to plant 1 million trees. We should be in a hurry to build a culture that will plant 1 million trees over the next generation.
I really like
Or
that as
10
a
million.
one-liner.
Or
Andrew's had his
Yeah.
hand up for ages, which I didn't notice because it
I
was
write
hidden in
that
his
down. I hadn't said that
background.
before.
Oh,
Okay.
you definitely want to write that down. That's a great one-liner. Yeah.
I was interested, Rowan, in the sort of challenge of selection of diversity of local varieties. Are sawmills up for testing new varieties for house building? You were saying there's a shortage of timber. I know in the UK, someone was asking me about Leyland cypress and could it be used in how, house construction, because it is in New Zealand. Well, of course, it depends on the climate and things like that. And the second question is, what about all the offcuts? Is there innovation on that front in terms of glulam beams or cellulose for other products?
Well, the federal government has just announced $100 million Australian, so it's not that much, into forestry research. A lot of that money will be spent for the industrial foresters who produce a very low quality wood because they don't manage their trees. They're looking at glulam and other opportunities to use that low value wood. We're at the other end of the spectrum where to be competitive, we've got to produce quality. The sawmill that we're working with, which hasn't even got a sawmill in there, they're the largest importer of American timber in Australia now, because all logging in native forest stopped here 25 years ago in our area. So the mills collapsed. They got bought out by government, compensated for the change in policy. There was not enough farm timber grown on private land, so the mills had no logs. So this mill started importing timber, and they can't mill their own timber, but they certainly can import, dry, process, and sell timber. And so we have to mill our logs and take the sawn timber in, and they process it. And they, having seen our timber now, the local mill is very excited about producing a run, sort of marketing a run of farm-grown Australian timbers. And we're hopefully working on the next few years, because we've got many growers who have got trees smaller than me, who started after me, but many of them have got more volume, and we want to feed that into a market. So we hope to brand farm-grown timber out of our region in the next 4 or 5 years. And for building purposes, structural timber will all be graded. Most of it will be appearance grade, flooring, lining, cladding, and other decking and other uses like that. Regarding the cypresses, we grow a lot of those cypresses. Some of them suffer from disease issues in Australia, but they produce you saw that my pine was F7. F5 is the strength of cypress. It's lighter, but it can be used in stud framing. It has the advantage of being more durable outside, so it has that ability. But we used a little bit of cypress in our own house because I was able to grade it as F5. The building inspector, I had to explain to them how you do the grading. They'd never seen visually graded timber before, but they were convinced because of the quality of the timber that it was fine. So we can actually market cypress as structural, but it has to be a very big section to make a strong beam. We've actually got a young guy in our community from the UK who did oak frame in the UK, greenwood framed houses and sheds and barns here. and he's using cypress for that purpose because it's durable outside. So he uses a green, and those trees generally come from old windbreaks on farms where you only get a couple of good logs out of a section of windbreak, but there's enough there to build a local construction industry on.
Andrew, oh, sorry, Andrew, not Andrew. Rowan, I'm going to slightly abuse my chair's privilege and sneak in a couple of questions, if that's okay. And they might just demonstrate how much I don't know about forestry. So I think there are two things you said I'd be interested to hear more on. One of which is we, don't necessarily have forest fires in the way that Australia does right now, but we're probably likely to see more of them in the future than we have done in the past. So how do you kind of factor management of forest fires or the potential risk of forest fires into your kind of design projects when you're working with your farmers? And my second one is that you talked about seed saving from some of the trees that you've grown. And I'm just wondering, do you kind of de facto save seed from all the trees you grew so that when you harvest the tree and it turns out to be exceptionally good for timber, you've got some stock from that tree? Or how does that process work?
The fire issue is, it's funny you say you might one day have fires, because I'll just we'll just go back to
We have
Zoom,
had them. They're probably just slightly less likely than the ones that you get.
Yeah, probably less destructive, but so can you see that picture of my nice oak trees? Is that on?
Yep.
Yep. So this is a picture of a friend of mine's property looking across their neighbour's farm where they've planted trees. The house, this is an intense wildfire, one of the worst days in their region. The fire went through the farm, burnt every blade of grass effectively got burnt. The trees got very damaged, but the house survived because it was surrounded by a European garden. It was a white timber house. It was low in the valley, which helped resist the fire. The one dead tree, which is this one with a sort of looks like it's got snow white foliage on it, that was a eucalypt, and the fire burnt through underneath those trees close to the house. Eucalypts are pretty bad. They drop a lot of very dry fuel on the ground. They carry a fire very fast. And what we tend to want to do is plant oak trees from Europe, in my experience. So this is around our house. We've just come out of summer. I plant oak trees. I do prune them up for timber. I enrich with younger oak trees. I graze the grass, and I run sprinklers underneath the trees during the summer to try and keep it green. And I would turn the sprinklers on if a fire was coming as well. So we use oaks grazing fuel management, and I do burn underneath the eucalypts and under the pines where they're close to trees to reduce the ground fuel level. So my strategy would be early spring, start burning wherever there's a buildup of pine needles or eucalypt litter. That's an easy time to burn because the grass is green, so the fire's not going to move into the paddocks. Once the grass dries off, we start sort of grazing more heavily around assets, and then using sprinklers to keep the grass a bit greener. And having the oak trees has been a real great advantage. So I doubt whether you'll have the wildfires we have because of the deciduous trees. We avoid many of our species have oils, the tea tree oils, eucalyptus oils. They're highly flammable. Pine trees burn pretty well, but we do graze and burn underneath those to reduce that risk. Cypress burn. All these things have oils that can burn very, very fast. So the deciduous trees, poplars and oaks particularly, we find are a fire suppressant. So we prefer those and grazing underneath them.
And seed saving?
Oh, sorry, seed saving. Yep. There's well, one of the advantages of growing trees and doing it and finding species that work well in your landscape is that a market then is to collect the seed from the trees that you grow because other farmers want to grow those. We actually sell black walnut seeds. I don't know of anyone else in Australia doing it. We collect them and sell them through the post. And that's a good income earner for us. Eucalypt and wattles, native seed that I collect from trees that are growing well here, I give to a local nursery. He gives me free trees back. So we trade seed for trees. I sell or collect acorns and a range of species. So the things that we can't, the species that I wouldn't grow for seed are the ones that where there is genetic research being done on an ongoing basis, but there's only a few select species that either the industry or the government are actually doing genetic work on. So all these other species, we plant a diverse range. We thin heavily. We get outcrossing between the best performing trees, and we collect seed from that, and we're confident we're getting better genetic stock as a result of that. The other market is cuttings, hybrid poplars, redwoods, and some other species we actually grow from cuttings. Cuttings allow us to take what we think is superior genetic material and mass produce it. Cuttings can sell for more. So I supply a cutting nursery with stock of redwood, and we'll be doing poplar, but also some of our native food, and they actually sell that on as well. So genetic material, whether it's seed or cuttings, is a good market because the more people who want to plant trees, and this is another aspect about the grants, our nurseries in our region have survived very well because we have hundreds of farmers going to their local nursery to buy trees. I've seen in other regions where they have big grant programs, the people managing the grant programs actually get big nurseries to produce hundreds of thousands of trees. And I know you've got this problem of importing trees from the continent because being a big grant operation, they can afford to go and buy and negotiate for hundreds of thousands of trees. And as a result, local nurseries miss out. So I wouldn't have a nursery I could sell stuff to because they've been demolished by the big grant programs. In our area, the nurseries survive because we work with them and they work with us, and we promote them to our community because farmers say, where can I get the trees from? Well, go down to Mike at this nursery. He's got them. And that's really important because it builds up that culture again of supplying all the needs you want. I'm surprised that in Europe you don't have nurseries in every small town like we do in our vicinity, because you're losing control of that genetic material, you're bringing disease in, and you're losing that ability to build up knowledge within the region about what works. And the nurserymen are really important advisors in the community because they learn from successful tree growers and they share that knowledge about where each species works in the landscape. We have a very strong focus on Indigenous growing generally, which means local nurseries can benefit because they grow local provenances for conservation purposes, and that helps sustain those local nurseries as well. And that's probably more important in Australia because we didn't have an ice age. So our plant species can vary from region to region quite dramatically because it's been 100,000 years of since they evolved, whereas yours have all just moved back in quite recently, and as a result, genetic diversity won't be as great. Each valley here has a different provenance of quite different behavior in many species. They're genetically quite different.
It's been so interesting hearing from you, Rowan. I think we're out of questions. I don't see any more hands up, and what's perfect because we're almost out of time. Oh, wait a minute, I said that, and now Steve's quickly popped his hand up. All right, one more question, Steve, but keep it sharpish, please.
So another way government can help is that governments actually use a lot of timber for marine and fluvial protection, for construction and all the rest of it. Is there any example in Australia where government's done good timber procurement and helped farmers
that's really interesting.
grow the right trees? Or is it not connected,
That's really interesting. You've touched on a sore point for us, Steve. The there's one big sawmill left in our whole state because they've closed down the native forest. The government actually owns half that sawmill. I think 49% of that sawmill. For public projects, the government specifies that the timber has to be certified, whether it's F.For.Sci certified or the other systems promoted by the industry here. The guy who runs that sawmill rang me up and said, we'd be happy to buy your timber, but because of the government's procurement requiring certification, you need to be certified, and it would cost you about $10,000 to certify one farm because of the government's requirements. So we have a ridiculous situation where the government wants to encourage farmers to grow trees for timber, but the way they've set up their own timber purchase, probably through a different department, means that we can't participate because of the hurdle of certification. There's nothing wrong with our logs. They're happy to buy them, but they can't mix uncertified and certified timber in the mill because the government has specified that. All the government needs to do is say, we will also buy farm-grown timber. All you have to do is tell us where it was grown, and we can check on Google Maps whether that farm exists, and we believe you. The cost of certification is a ridiculous hurdle affecting small grower participation in the timber market, and I suspect that's happening right around the world because the big companies are quite happy to do it. But you know, it's obvious that a tree's, you can look at the timber, you know the tree's been planted and managed. With, you know, in the effort to save tropical forests, they've actually undermined timber production on farms in Australia, which is a real issue we have with the green groups. They've got to clean that act up so that we can improve that. But good point. Thanks,
All right,
Steve.
and that is our final question. Before we give our final thanks to Rowan and let him go back to bed, Maureen, is there anything that we need to mention that I haven't thought of?
No, I think you've covered everything, Harriet. It's just to say thank you. I think we have a lot of Irish Agroforestry Forum members here this evening. Rowan, your talk was very interesting because there's lots of conversations in Ireland about land designation and planting of trees and the way to get more trees on farms. So a lot of the issues are the same. But I would say this, the grants
And I want
sorry, yeah, we have huge grants here. They're
I want to thank And if there's anyone here who watching who I met when I travelled around Ireland with Claire and looked at a few agroforestry sites, thank you very much for hosting us, and I hope to be back over there sometime in the future.
Yes. Well, I think our next session is the 16th of July, and I believe it might actually be Maureen that's presenting, but we will send details of that nearer to the time. So yeah, just thank you so very, very much, Rowan. Absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you for getting up so ridiculously early to do it in person. Much appreciated, so we can have the Q&A. And yeah, the European Agroforestry members are lucky to have you. I'm sure it will be a scintillating conference. But yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Maureen, you're up for ending the recording.